obviously, as the name implies, these are related, and I mentioned this before, but protein's unique from the other macronutrients for quite a few reasons. One is not a major energy source. It really shouldn't be. We should rely on the other two macronutrients for energy. And protein is the only one of these that has nitrogen. So, got that one right? So there's a few different reasons we need to consume protein, and one of them is the source of nitrogen. And it's not, protein in our body is not the only thing that has nitrogen. There's other molecules that have nitrogen, so we need to get nitrogen from the diet. We do that by consuming protein. The second reason we need to consume dietary protein is to get essential amino acids. And we'll talk about that. And kind of as the term implies, those are amino acids that we have to have, but we don't make. So we get them from the diet. And we'll talk about how that works. So we'll talk a little bit about, like we did before, here's our outline. We'll look at the structures a little bit just to give us an idea. Digestion and absorption, protein in the body, protein in foods, some of the health effects of protein, and then recommended intakes. And most of this will have to do with for the general population. And then tomorrow I'll talk about this in the context of sports nutrition and athletes and physical performance. So, basics, yeah, he's ready. Beach Chief here, future Beach Chief. We've got proteins are made of 20 different amino acids in our body. And 9 of those are essential. We have to get adequate amounts from our diet. The other 11 we can make. Most important tissue for making those other amino acids, the liver. And by far, the liver is the most important metabolic organ or tissue that we have. It does tons of different things for metabolism, including synthesizing certain amino acids. Now, each amino acid, called an amino acid because it has an amine group or an amino group, and that's the NH2. It has an acid group, just like a fatty acid. This is a carboxylic acid group, so it's an amino acid. It has a hydrogen atom that's attached to a central carbon, and it has a unique side group. And the side group makes each amino acid. It gives it different functions. The sequence of amino acids in each protein determines its unique shape and function. So in protein world, a lot of times we say structure equals function. Protein has to have a certain shape or structure to perform a specific function. In order to get to that structure, it has to have specific amino acids. So that's why there's so much variety in the amino acids, because we have so many different proteins in our body that have to have each a different function. So here's the generic structure of an amino acid. Okay? Central carbon, amine group, carboxylic acid group. This is the one that provides variety or flavor to the different amino acids. So here's some examples here. Simplest amino acid is called glycine. Just a hydrogen here. Alanine is relatively simple as well. Aspartic acid side group is a charge, carboxylic acid group. That's why we call that. And we have phenylalanine. A really good, simple way of thinking of these, though, is that aspartic acid, water soluble. So if a protein has to do something that allows it to interact with water, aspartic acids can provide that property. Phenylalanine, you might have heard of this from other contexts, hydrophobic. In other words, it's fat soluble. So if a protein is in a part of a cell or interacting with other molecules that involve lipids or something like that, phenylalanine can be used as an amino acid for that. So there's lots of different options. So at every part of a protein, there's 20 different options. And overall, when you kind of do the math and say 20 options here, 20 options for the next one, 20 options for the next one, it's unlimited the types of proteins that we can build. It's estimated that, you guys heard of the Human Genome Project, right? You know what that is? All of our genes. Yeah. Basically, they sequenced human DNA. They didn't do mine. Who'd they do? They did a couple individuals and basically said, this is a generic sequence for everyone. And everybody leaned back and went, wow, that's fantastic. Look what we did. And now everybody's going, what does that mean? Well, now you have to take that DNA and basically translate it into proteins. Because the proteins are the ones that actually do the work and function inside cells. But that DNA determines the amino acid sequence of proteins. Everybody's DNA in here is slightly different. So we all have slightly different proteins. So we look different, we're built different, we think differently because the proteins are slightly different. So that's the significance of the Genome Project. And that's kind of where we're now able to kind of work both ends of the equation. Now, for example, when a person has a genetic alteration that makes them unique, we can look at the protein and say why this is unique. And for a lot of us, that determines our nutrient requirements. My proteins are different than anybody else's in here. I have slightly different nutrient requirements because of that. And that's one of the beautiful things about nutrition is it's slightly different for everyone. Everyone responds slightly differently to diet plans and nutrition and all of that. That's the great thing about it. That's also the hard part about it. And that's why we're individualizing all of your nutrition plans, because everybody's going to respond slightly differently. We have guidelines to work from, but it's basically empirical. It's repeated measures and trying different things until it works for you. So I don't know if I've said this enough, but any feedback that you guys want from us, let us know. And we'll continue to work and tweak everybody's plans until we get things that we're getting desired outcomes. But a lot of it has to do with this. Chemist's view of amino acids, non-essential amino acids, these are the ones that the body can create. So in other words, we say they're dispensable in our diet. We don't have to have them. The non-essential amino acids are these. And you don't have to memorize these, obviously, but you can see there's quite a few of them. There's 11 of these. The essential amino acids, there's 9 of them. We either do not make or we do not make adequate amounts of these 9. So we take them in our diet. And there are specific amounts that we're looking for when we set up diets for this. In general, not that difficult to get those essential amino acids if you do it right. So what are some of the protein functions? Well, some carry and store materials in the blood. Classic examples is these guys. Parts of these are proteins, and they move lipids through the blood. But it takes proteins to do that. Why are LDL and HDL different? Because they have different proteins attached to them. And those proteins determine what's going to happen to these. So proteins in that case are moving materials like cholesterol and triglycerides through the blood. Some provide strength, like tendons and muscle. What are a couple famous proteins in muscle? Have you heard of actin, myosin? When we say a muscle fiber, inside the muscle fiber, they what are called filaments that are actually mostly involving actin and myosin. That's what slides along each other when we either have to contract a muscle or let it extend. And it's actually those interactions that gives that muscle fiber the ability to either lengthen or shorten. And that's what allows us to make movements in our skeletal structure and lots of other things. So along the way, that's providing strength and mobility. Some require minerals for activation, like hemoglobin and iron. Well, hemoglobin is a combination of heme, globin protein, and in the middle of the heme is iron. And what does that do? Transports what? Oxygen. That's how we move oxygen through the blood. And where is hemoglobin? In red blood cells. Yeah. If we took your blood sample now and we spun it down, we'd probably find about 37 to 45% of the length of that tube would be red blood cells. So there's a lot of them. In one of our labs, in the nutrition lab, I have the students do a blood stain, and we look under a light microscope at cells that stain, and they'll see that probably 99% of all the cells in your blood are red blood cells. What are they there for? Transport oxygen, because oxygen is so important for a lot of things. Well, if a person has compromised protein status, they're not eating the right amount of protein or not enough, that can compromise your ability to make red blood cells. And that can have a significant effect on your ability to do work, on your ability to think, on your ability to do anything, because oxygen delivery can be compromised. So that can be part of that. And iron as well, of course, has to be part of that. So protein denaturation, that involves the uncoiling or unwinding of protein, and it changes its ability to function. So for example, proteins can be denatured by heat and acid. So if you cook your food, it has a protein source. Classic example is an egg. When you put it in heat and you see the structure of that egg change, one of the things that's happening is those proteins are denaturing. The interactions between all of the amino acids, a lot of them are based on what are called thermodynamic principles. As soon as you add heat to that, you start causing randomization of those interactions, the protein falls apart. And that's what it looks like. Is there any way to get that back together? Nope. Okay. One of the reasons it's so important to thermoregulate as you go through exercise, as you go through anything, is because proteins are very sensitive to heat. If your core temperature gets above a certain level, why is it lethal? Proteins denature. pH is also a part of this. I said that blood glucose is regulated very tightly. Blood pH even tighter. Blood pH is always between 7.35 and 7.45. If it gets outside of that pH range, proteins denature. And what happens? A person will assume room temperature pretty quickly. You will not survive very long because proteins denature. A lot of them are required to maintain life, and that's why one of the main reasons our body is so has the ability to maintain pH, because protein structure depends on it. Went through all that, I think. Now, protein digestion absorption. Protein digestion actually starts a little bit in the stomach. When you consume a protein, it'll go down the esophagus into the stomach, and in the stomach, there's an enzyme called pepsin. You guys might have heard of that one. That's relatively famous. That'll start. That and hydrochloric acid will tend to break down proteins. What is the hydrochloric acid there for? Causes the protein to denature. So the protein starts unwinding, and what does that do? That allows pepsin to be more effective. So the protein starts getting chopped up in the stomach. It's nowhere near digested yet, goes in the small intestine, process continues. Okay? So as it goes through the small intestine, we have a lot of enzymes that are required for that. Why do you need so many different enzymes? Exactly. There's so many different amino acids, and each of these enzymes prefers a specific amino acid sequence. So you need lots of different enzymes to break that protein up. Now, protein's a little bit unique because protein basically digests into dipeptides. Now, what do you think that means? Two amino acids together. Tripeptides is 3, and free or single amino acid, we'll call them free amino acids. That's just one amino acid. What's interesting about protein is about 67% of all of your dietary protein is absorbed like this, di and tripeptides. Doesn't all have to go to free amino acids for absorption. Okay? Then it goes into the intestinal cells, and then they're all cleaved into free amino acids. So we absorb di and tripeptides, and then intestinal cells finish it so we have all free amino acids. And one of the reasons I'm saying this is there's a lot of supplements out there that are amino acid supplements, branched-chain amino acid supplements, all of that. And I would say ideally you're consuming high-quality sources of protein, not individualized amino acids. It's probably not beneficial. There are some exceptions I can talk to you guys about if you have questions about that. But in general, dietary proteins are better to consume. Now, how much protein can we digest and absorb? A few hundred grams. Really significant amounts.
Is it true that you can only absorb like 20 to 25 at one sitting, or
No.
can you do 100 at once?
Yep.
So like you realize your diet's kind of screwed the whole day, you're short 100 grams of protein, you can literally consume those all and your body would be able to process that?
Yes. Not ideal, but you can. Yeah. Be better if the person doesn't do that, but you can, yeah. You know, and I'd say the ceiling for protein intake is probably about 300 grams a day. That's a lot of protein. Most people don't need anywhere near that amount. But if you get above that, most nutritionists will probably say, yeah, I probably wouldn't do that for an extended period of time. Okay, that can be not beneficial, but a lot of people will say, oh, if you eat too much protein, it hurts your kidneys, it causes more work for your kidneys and your livers. It does, but no, I wouldn't say that's harmful. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Right, so proteins are versatile and unique in the body. The synthesis of protein is determined by genetic information. Went through that. Proteins constantly being broken down and synthesized in the body. Have you ever heard that? Use it or lose it?
Yes.
It's really true for protein. If you're not stimulating proteins in your body, more specifically skeletal muscle than anything, your body tends to go to degrading that protein. And the reason it's doing that is to provide a mechanism of adaptation. If you made proteins and they stayed around for years, you wouldn't be able to adapt to changes in physicality or anything like that. So what your body does is it's in a kind of a consistent state of change, especially for muscle. So what do? You consistently stimulate it and use your diet to cause beneficial effects. And that whole process is called protein turnover, and it happens 24/7. And as soon as a person stops using protein, it's susceptible to breakdown and removal. Okay? So what do? One of the things we do, consistently take in good high-quality sources of protein. Protein's really the main way that we get nitrogen. So we can actually look at studies that quantify the amount of nitrogen we consume from protein and the amount of nitrogen that we lose. And we lose most of our nitrogen in the urine, in urea, and we lose some of it in the feces. If you balance intake compared to excretion, you can tell whether or not a person is getting enough protein. So when we give you recommendations for protein intake, it's considering all of those research studies that use those to determine whether or not groups have enough. So when we look at your physical activities, we're going to adapt the protein to make sure that you have enough based on science. We're also, obviously, in a few months, we're going to follow up on that to look at changes in body composition. We need to provide you enough protein so that changes in body composition are optimal, but we'll use carbohydrate and fat to bring in the calories. So we're going to balance all of that. But basically, if you look at, for example, if a person is losing more nitrogen than they take in, we say they're in negative nitrogen balance. And that's not optimal. Generally, that happens if a person has some type of chronic disease or they're not eating enough protein, they're losing too much. So that's not optimal. There are certain times in your life where you want to be in positive nitrogen balance, where you're consuming more nitrogen than you're losing. If you're trying to add muscle, if a person's pregnant, or they're trying to make changes like that, they want to have slightly more nitrogen than they're losing to make sure you're supporting muscle growth or tissue growth during pregnancy. Okay? For individuals that are sedentary, that aren't exercising, not trying to do any of that, we want them at equilibrium. So we match protein losses versus intake. And so we have certain numbers that we look at for that as well. Okay? I won't go into this proteomics. Interesting, but oops. Now, one of the things that I mentioned before was carbohydrates and insulin and protein synthesis, and bear with me on this. This is kind of biology, but here's DNA in a cell. When DNA is converted during transcription, it goes from DNA to an RNA molecule. That RNA molecule leaves the nucleus and goes into the other parts of the cell. So you can imagine, for example, this is a muscle fiber. Muscle fibers actually have quite a few nuclei in them, and that allows them to respond more significantly during this process. The mRNA goes into, in this case, we'll say the cytosol of a muscle fiber, and that cell uses structures called ribosomes to start making proteins. You guys, any of this You've probably heard some of this, right? As that ribosome is pulling the mRNA through, the ribosome is incorporating what are called tRNAs to match the sequence of the mRNA with the appropriate amino acid. So this is called translation, or more specifically, elongation during translation. So what are we doing? We're making a protein. Each of those tRNA molecules here has an amino acid on one end. It's charged with an amino acid. So that when that ribosome has two tRNAs that are close together, if these are the amino acids, it'll put a peptide bond between them. And then what does it do? This amino acid now is put onto the peptide. This tRNA is empty. The ribosome kicks it out. Moves to the next spot on the mRNA, pulls in the appropriate tRNA. That's translation. It happens unbelievably fast. It'll do that all the way until it gets to the end of the mRNA sequence. The protein's made, the ribosome falls apart, you've made the protein. Okay? Insulin stimulates that process. So what do you want to do post-exercise? Prepare, make new proteins, adapt to that exercise. So you want carbohydrates, insulin to go up, so you stimulate that. The opposite side of that is, if we make a protein, let's say we have those filaments that I mentioned before, as you're doing exercise, especially in the eccentric phase, which means resisting lengthening of the muscle fiber. Have you guys ever done like things called negatives or anything like that, plyometrics? So when you guys are running down or hiking down a hill, you are using a lot of eccentric movement. And that's why you get really sore from doing stuff like that. That tends to be an accentuated way of damaging muscle fibers, and it helps you adapt. Okay? After you're done with that workout, degradation is elevated. So after a workout, protein synthesis goes up a little bit, degradation goes up more. So what are you doing? You're losing more muscle than you're adding. So what do you have to do? Use nutrition to change that. So we use carbohydrate to get insulin up, and what else do we do? Consume protein, so we have the amino acids to support this. And when you put all that together, that's kind of an anabolic cocktail that helps with reparation and helps provide fuel for the next time. One of the reasons it's important to have what we call high-quality proteins is so that as these ribosomes are moving along and pulling in the appropriate tRNA, the tRNA is loaded with the appropriate amino acid. If it requires an essential amino acid and our diet is poor in essential amino acids, what happens here? Nothing. Translation can't continue. So if we lack essential amino acids, protein translation is going to stop. And that's a problem. And unfortunately, that's what you see in some scenarios, like in developing countries, or any time where individuals have compromised protein intake, they start wasting. Because our protein's always being broken down, and in those individuals, they can't replace it. And so you see this kind of systemic loss. In exercise, it means we just don't have optimal results. Okay? Other rules. Kind of went through this, building of materials for growth and maintenance. For example, collagen. Collagen is the most common protein in our body. Collagen is what's holding us together. If you want to be dramatic about it, you can say collagen. We exist as multicellular organisms because of collagen. Holds everything together. So we have to be able to synthesize collagen in adequate amounts. Collagen is actually the main protein in bone. And you guys, when I did the decks on you, I said, this is how much the minerals in your bone weigh. But what are those minerals attached to? Most of them, collagen. So bone is also a dynamic structure that is basically proteins with minerals attached. So you have to have adequate protein as well for bone growth. Right? And also new proteins. You have to have it to replace tissues, including skin, hair, nails, and GI tract lining, all of that. Some proteins function as enzymes. Right? They facilitate anabolic or building and catabolic or breaking down chemical reactions. We make insulin in general. Insulin is made of amino acids because it's a peptide or a protein. So that helps regulate processes in the body. Transporters, I mentioned this. Some proteins carry lipids, vitamins, minerals, and oxygen in the body. Some act as pumps in cell membranes. They transfer compounds from one side of the cell membrane to the other. Classic example here is the sodium-potassium pump, which controls the sodium-potassium gradient across cell membranes. It's estimated that I think a third of all of our energy every day is used by this pump. And one of the things that it's important for, muscle contraction or relaxation. So another reason, got to have adequate amounts of sodium and potassium levels. That's why we get our electrolytes, to make sure we can maintain that equilibrium across cell membranes. We have antibodies that are part of this. So if a person has compromised protein status, it can compromise their immune system, their ability to fight infections, for example. And that can be a problem. Again, example, developing countries where kids don't have high quality protein, something like measles can become lethal because they do not have the immune system to combat that exposure. Okay? If they do, then the second time they tend to see an antigen or exposure to something, their immune system is primed for it. Now, not ideal, but some proteins can serve as energy and glucose if needed. So, one of the take-home points from this is we can make glucose from amino acids. Now, what's the storage form of carbohydrate in our body? Specific molecule. How do we store glucose, carbohydrate in our body? What's a big molecule name? Remember glycogen? So we have a way of storing glucose. How do we store fat? Triglycerides inside fat cells. How do we store protein? We really don't. There's not a storage form. So where is most of it? As a functional protein. Most of the protein in our body is skeletal muscle. So let's say we're not consuming enough carbohydrate and or not enough calories, and we have to have glucose. We can take amino acids and use it to make glucose. Where do most of those amino acids come from? Skeletal muscle. So if a person is not consuming adequate carbohydrate, it's counterproductive because they'll break down muscle to get glucose. So we have to make sure that that doesn't happen. So we want to avoid that. Other roles, blood clotting and vision, it's also part of all of that. So I think I went through some of this. Protein turnover, amino acid pools, the supply of amino acids available to make new proteins. And what this means is one of the reasons our body can do that is, or breaks down protein is, let's say, for example, I'm doing physical work that focuses on my upper body. And now all of a sudden my regimen changes and I focus on my lower body. What I can do is I can actually break down some of the muscle fibers in my upper body, use those amino acids to make more muscle in my legs. So you might have an amino acid like alanine that's part of a muscle fiber in my forearm on Monday. On Tuesday it's in a muscle fiber in my leg. Our body uses protein like that, and what that does is that decreases our dietary protein requirements because we're reusing amino acids in our body. If we didn't do that, our protein requirements would probably double or triple because it's so commonly done. So that's an advantage of that. So those amino acids can be reused to do that.
What's
Now,
the normal protein requirement? What would be the normal, would you say?
So if a person is exercising, and let's say they're doing regular endurance type exercise, their protein requirements, let's say they weigh 150 pounds, it's probably...
Let's say he's 175, 5'9".
Endurance exercise, 100 and...
83. Yeah, when I did that zone diet with the 40% at my weight, it was like 183.
183 grams a day.
Well, that's 195 at 5'6" at 40% protein. No, not 183. Sorry, not 103. I apologize. It was
112.
112.
112 grams endurance for endurance, basically an endurance athlete.
For just one day?
Yep.
I thought you needed 130 at least to keep your brain functioning properly.
Carbohydrate.
Carbs, okay.
So for protein, you're about like 112 for that. Now it depends on some other factors, but The amount of protein turnover in a day for a person that weighs 175 pounds is probably over 300 grams. 300 grams of protein is turning over in your body. So if you didn't do that, you'd have to get that from your diet. So you'd have to take in all that protein from your diet. If every time you broke down a protein, the amino acid was lost and not reused. It'd be a huge change in our diet. Here's the problem, or one of the issues. Protein's the only one that has nitrogen. If we have too much nitrogen and it becomes free, it can become ammonia. I think we all know ammonia is not good for us. Ammonia tends to be toxic to the brain and central nervous system. We have ammonia that's generated in our body. And when we're breaking down amino acids, if that amine group comes free, remember that NH3, it can convert back and forth between ammonia and ammonium ion. Both of them are harmful. So what do? We either try to put that in the urine, or we run it through the urea cycle in the liver. And our liver basically takes that ammonia and incorporates it into the urea molecule. And then it puts urea into the blood, and that goes through our kidneys, and we put it in our urine. That's how mammals do it. That's if the liver's functioning properly. If a person has liver dysfunction, that's a problem. So what do? Control protein intake. Try to minimize that. For normal individuals, though, we can take extra nitrogen and put it into urea and get rid of it. So that's how we basically protect ourselves from ammonia. So some people say, don't eat too much protein, it can cause that. In general, it won't, but if a person has any type of kidney dysfunction or liver dysfunction, for their clinical nutrition, you cut back on protein intake. You have to. Otherwise, it can cause what's called hepatic encephalopathy, and it can cause brain damage. Okay? So here's one of the issues. If you don't have enough carbohydrate, and you're breaking down amino acids to get it, you're getting more nitrogen in the blood. So you're forcing your system to make more urea. And as you're doing that, some of those amino acids become ketones as well. So you're starting to accumulate ketones, which is not optimal, no matter what's on the internet. Okay? So again, all of this kind of goes together. We generally don't want to use protein as an energy source. So what do we call high-quality proteins? Well, a high-quality protein has all 9 essential amino acids, and it's easily digested. So if you think about it, the best protein that we can consume in our diet would look just like the protein we're trying to replace in our body. We're closer genetically to animals than we are plants. So in general, animal protein tends to be a higher quality than plant protein. Now there's...
You're saying that vegan should not be vegan.
I would never say that. Okay, well, but that's kind of one of the things that needs to be considered when a person's choosing protein sources. Now what you can do is proteins can be combined to complement each other. So complementary proteins supply all the essential amino acids. So for example, a diet inadequate in any of the essential amino acids limits protein intake, but the quality of protein is measured by its amino acid content, digestibility, and ability to support growth. So along those lines, digestibility. In general, animal proteins tend to be more highly digested and absorbed, approximately 90 to 99%. Plant proteins, depending, are somewhere below that generally, and soy and legumes are generally about 90%. And one of the reasons why soy protein is kind of popular is because of plant proteins. It tends to be a higher quality. Quinoa and some other protein sources have come along, but some of them are better than others. So I guess what I want to say is, in general, there's lots of proteins that would be considered high quality proteins, but there's varying degrees of that. Okay? So we're looking at amino acid composition. I went through a lot of this already. But if you did an animal study, for example, we did this years ago, if you took two groups of rats, of weanling rats, in other words, young rats that are growing at fast rates, and I put one group on, let's say, for example, I think I have an egg protein or a dairy protein. The other group, let's say I had on an oat protein, a plant protein, and every day I fed them the same amount. They ate ad libitum as much as they wanted. You would see a significant difference in growth rates. Because in the growing rats, if they require an essential amino acid that isn't there because it might be lower in oat protein than it is in our egg protein, that can affect their growth. If you look at, human studies like North Korea, those dictators there, they say, have decreased the actual height of that population by something like 2 or 3 inches in one generation because of the poor nutrition that they've been exposed to. And a lot of that has to do with protein quality. So it's very important. You can't do those human studies unless you're in one of those countries. Never get that through the U.S. Obviously, that's unethical. So you do it in animals, and it's significant, especially for growing individuals. You have to make sure they have high-quality protein. Same thing in Africa. I'm collaborating on a study in Malawi with one of my coworkers. Phenomenal project. These are pregnant, malnourished women, and they are a few months into pregnancy. Their average height was 5 feet. Their average weight was 101 pounds because of the nutritional conditions there. And a lot of them have 4 or 5 children. And a lot of them are kind of in that. So obviously the mom's health and the development of the kids is an issue. And so one of the things that we're looking at, and my colleague is phenomenal for doing this, and a lot of our Cal Poly students have gone over there and worked in Malawi on these projects. You're looking at different, how can you get the most for your buck and what protein sources? And so they're looking at whey protein and some other combinations that are above the standard practice. Standard practice for a long time has been like a kind of a soy blend, which is not as high a quality protein as some of the other ones. So it has significant effects. Went through all that. We'll talk about complementary proteins. So down at the bottom, you can combine plant foods together that contain all the essential amino acids. It doesn't just have to come from one source. You can put food sources together. Vegetarians can use this method. So here's the basics of it. All of these are essential amino acids for humans: isoleucine, lysine, methionine, and tryptophan. Legumes tend to have inadequate amounts of isoleucine and lysine, but they have adequate amounts of methionine and tryptophan. Grains, the opposite. So what do? Put them in the same meal. Do they have to be in the same meal? They should be. Closer together, the better. And the rationale, for years they didn't know that. Finally, a few years ago, they did some good studies that indicated that. Ideally, they're in the same meal. Put them together, you have all the essential amino acids required for protein translation.
What would be like a good combination of that?
What's that?
What would be a good combination of that?
That's the rice and beans, anything like that, yeah. Yep. Yeah. What about weight control, health effects, protein? High protein foods are often high fat foods, so you have to be careful. So you choose lean sources. Protein at each meal provides satiety. Every time you sit down, you want your plate to have carbohydrate, protein, and some healthy fats. And your menus will. Adequate protein, moderate fat, and sufficient carbohydrate better support weight loss long term. Some studies have shown if you minimize carbohydrate, increase intake of even fat and protein, you'll have more rapid weight loss. But long term, you're better to stay with more the moderate intake of each of those, and studies have indicated that. And I went through this. It won't cause kidney disease, but if it's there, you want to be careful with that. So in general, there's a wide range. 10 to 35% of energy intake is from protein. The protein RDA, so this is the recommended dietary allowance, is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram per day. Now, when Specialist Flores asked me this, he asked me basically for if an endurance athlete is going to be higher than this. This is for a sedentary individual. Okay, that's not us. So we need more than this. Endurance athletes are generally, and I'll go through these numbers again, approximately 1.2 to 1.4. Strength athletes, 1.6 to 1.8. So a lot more. So what do? We can increase their protein. Also want to make sure they get adequate amounts of carbohydrate to make sure they get enough calories. But in general, if you're exercising, you can have more calories. so you can increase the protein to make sure you support the exercise. So even with those numbers, we're assuming the people are healthy, because that can modify protein requirements. Protein is mixed quality, so some of it's higher quality protein, some of it's not, and that the body will use protein efficiently. So you want to make sure that they have enough calories and they're not using protein for energy, because that'll compromise that. What the nutrition students that are working with you are going to do is they're going to calculate on body weight. Okay? And by doing that, they'll make sure you have adequate amounts of protein to support that, and it will be within this range. Okay? But how do you determine that? Like how much protein athletes need and things like that? Nitrogen balance studies. And a lot of those have been done in different populations so that we know that range to use. If you go above that, let's say you go above 2 grams per kilogram body weight, it's not beneficial. The only people that can benefit from that are some athletes that are on performance-enhancing medications.
We're doing nitrogen studies on us.
What's that?
Nitrogen studies on us, so we can try to ensure that we're getting the protein we need.
So, in order to do a nitrogen balance study, you generally sequester a population. They're usually in a metabolic facility. Everything that goes in is measured and carefully monitored. Everything that comes out is collected and carefully analyzed. So you do urine. You do. What's that? So we'd collect all the urine.
Oh, so.
All urine, all feces.
Is there an at-home nitrogen measuring test?
Not really. Yeah, not really. Yeah, they're not easy to do. They're expensive, and I was involved in an animal study years ago. I haven't done a human one, but enough of them have been done. We would look for similar populations, so we could look for military training studies and things like that. They've been done in those. Yeah. They're kind of extremely important. So fortunately, they've been done. And especially some of the classic studies were done when they were setting up rations for military populations.
Maybe like the MREs, like Sam and you guys study it.
Yeah. And they realized that's one of the first things that indicated carbohydrate has a protein sparing effect. So when they did these, they saw that this certain population, in general, even if you don't eat protein, you're losing nitrogen. And they found out that people lose approximately 24 grams of protein every day, even if you're not eating it. If you don't eat adequate amounts of carbohydrates, approximately 150 grams a day, it doubles. Your protein loss doubles. So that's why we say you got to have enough carbohydrate to help maintain that body protein. So that's another factor for us. Yep. Any questions?
We were going to cover like some different types of proteins that you said were better options, like supplemental wise. Like,
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Kind of like the plant-based ones versus the animal-based.
Soy, whey, iso.
I'll talk a little bit about whey and why it's beneficial tomorrow, and that's why we had it in there. Some of the other ones,
Casein.
we can talk a little bit about casein as well, and some of the plant ones. We can work on that. I won't have that ready by tomorrow, but we'll definitely send that to you. Because combination is the best way to go about it. Yeah.
So somebody who lifts weights a lot, like twice a day, 5-6 days a week, amino acids during the workout, would it suffice or anything like that?
Not really.
Each body fold.
Have you ever heard of type 9? Gotta ask.
No.
We gotta let them see the video.
There's a lot of stuff out there.
There is.
A lot of stuff out there. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yes. You can do a test on
It's
your
a
students
pre-workout
here.
for prisoners.
It's what prisoners use as a pre-workout.
It's just instant coffee.
Instant coffee with like Coke or Pepsi, and then you mix it up and they drink it.
You gotta let it sit though.
You gotta let it sit. And you mix it up and it literally looks like mud, and then they drink it.
No joke, there's a big Jack who's like seriously into it.
Yeah, that's the thing is, if you like, I used to do a lot of personal training, and you'd go into the gym, and like you've got some of the bodybuilders in there, and people are just like, yeah, I'll do whatever they do. I don't think you realize what they're doing, and they'll see them eating any supplement or anything, and like, I need some of that. That's not what's doing that. So it's very interesting the way that get a couple people that are like, this is what I did, and you look at me like, okay, what does The Rock do? Okay, I'll do that.
He eats.
Yeah, and it's
His diet's crazy.
Yeah, he
Ye-
eats a lot.
Yeah, and for the most part, kind of what the science says and what my experience says, focus on the macronutrients. That's where you get most of your effects. Even when I teach a sports nutrition classes, that's what I focus on. The supplements are nowhere near as effective.
I think your MyFitnessPal breaks it. I think you might have to pay for it. But
No.
It'll break down your macros.
It broke it down because when I did those numbers that Captain Windsor showed us, after that he told us to break it down by the zone, just for an example, just to practice. And that was the 40% protein, 30% carbs, 30% fat, and then we did our weight and everything like that. And then when you put it in MyFitnessPal, it told me like 203 grams of carbs, 90 grams of fat, and 270 grams of protein with a more than moderate physical activity level.
Mm-hmm.
So 2,700 calories.
Yeah, I would flip those.
Flip those, the protein and the carbs.
Your carbs should always be more.
Okay.
Yeah, the additional protein is.
Yeah, that's what the MyFitnessPal did off of his numbers. So I was just curious. So
Yeah.
Once you give me your guys' numbers, I don't give a fuck what that says.
We'll switch
You're
those.
recording
Yeah.
again, I apologize.
Yeah, again, and we'll be at that threshold, and then we can put in, because there's lots of nutrients that the carbohydrates have in addition to that the protein sources don't. Carbohydrates give us a lot of other vitamins and minerals, including things like electrolytes that the protein won't. So we have to kind of take all of that into consideration, and then we'll tweak as we go. Good?
Amazing.
Okay, guys. Thank you very much. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a good night.
Look at all these questions.
Yes.
So when we make our plan, according to our weight and everything, will some of ours be